Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you so much for joining us for the Startups Need Help, What's Your Strategy webinar. I'm Penny Lewandowski. I'm principal of my company called Change at the Edges in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I'm also a consultant to the Edward Lowe Foundation. I led the foundation's entrepreneurship team and then their national outreach efforts for the past 13 years. So I'm going to be your moderator for today, and I'm really excited about this session since more and more economic developers are really beginning to understand how important it is to practice, what we're calling entrepreneurship-led economic development in their communities and their regions and their states. And so what we're going to talk about today is really important stuff. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities tells us that 80% of all jobs in every state, not just a few states, come from existing businesses. And so these homegrown businesses, they make a big difference in our communities. I mean, not just in employment, but in spurring innovation, in attracting talent and capital, and also in their willingness to give back to the communities that help them become successful. So it's really important to us as entrepreneur support organizations, economic developers, to support these companies. But some of you on the call probably know this isn't always easy. I mean, working with entrepreneurs can be really different than some of the more, transactional aspects of economic development. So entrepreneurs have a lot of needs, and those needs change as they grow. Startups don't need the same thing as growth companies, and on and on. So today, we're really grateful to welcome two experts who are going to show their experiences and their insights into how, your organization can support startups and entrepreneurs in your community. And before we get started with them, I just want to share a couple of housekeeping notes from IEDC. So first of all attendees are going to be muted during the webinar. So if you have a cat like mine, if you work at home who meows as soon as I get on the phone, we won't be able to hear her. And then to ask a question of the speakers, just type your questions into the question box that you'll see on the right-hand side. And then at the end of the presentations, we'll have a Q&A period at the end of the session, and I'll pose your questions to the panelists. So start thinking about those. And then within about 24 hours of our webinar today, you're going to get an evaluation emailed to you by IEDC. And we ask that you just take a couple of minutes and fill that out, because IEDC really does use your feedback to change and improve the webinar seminars in the series. And then at the end of that evaluation, you'll receive a link where you can download today's presentations. So now I'm excited to introduce our speakers, and we're going to start with Evan Absher. So Evan is a senior program officer in entrepreneurship for the Ewing Marion Coughlin Foundation, where his work includes identifying ways to help cities further innovation and growth in their communities. Evan is also focused on helping to educate policymakers on new insights and understandings that result from the foundation-supported research, and providing support for the foundation's entrepreneurship and education departments in their formation of applicable local policies and programs. Before Evan joined the Coughlin Foundation, he worked as a special assistant for policy in the office of Mayor Sly James, who is mayor of Kansas City, Missouri. Earlier, he founded a small theater company in Chicago and was a professional actor. So Evan really brings a wealth of experience to this, and I'm really excited to hear what he has to say. So Evan, thank you so much for making time for us today. And without further delay, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Penny, and thanks everyone for inviting me to speak. I think this is a wonderful opportunity. Your organization, this organization has done fantastic work and will continue to do fantastic work, and I love the opportunity to work entrepreneurship into economic development. And it's true what you said, Penny. It is very different and much more relational than traditional economic development. And in that way, the Coughlin Foundation has really tried to provide rigor and understanding and research behind this sort of relational ecosystem idea. This idea that entrepreneurs are a product of their community, And so therefore, how do communities foster entrepreneurs and grow them? You know, I think what we'll see as we move through this is all companies, all policymakers, all sort of stakeholders in a community can play an important role in developing entrepreneurs. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Let's see if I have control here. Having a hard time. There we go. This is so this first slide is our benefactor, Ewing Marion Kaufman. Mr. K, as we call him in the foundation, started his pharmaceutical company after he worked as a pharmaceuticals sales rep at another company. The first year he started at that first company that he worked for, he made more money than the president based on the commission formula. The president didn't appreciate that, so the president cut his territory in half. The next year, Mr. K made more money than the president again, and so the president then cut his territory in half a second time. So Mr. K promptly quit and started his own pharmaceutical company, sales company. And of course, that became Marion Labs. That was Marion Labs. And when he finally sold Marion Labs, he sold it without ever taking an ounce of outside private equity, no venture capital, and he made 300 people millionaires in 1967 in Kansas City. It was truly formative for the Kansas City ecosystem and economy. But it was homegrown, and it was bootstrapped. Mr. K started that company with his savings, which he won as a merchant marine playing poker on the ships that he sailed on. So he's a very interesting guy. And there's some great stories about his sort of growing that company early on. So entrepreneurship. We think entrepreneurship is an important part of economic development in any community. While it might not be the largest percentage total of economic output for any community or any local ecosystem, it is an important part. And namely, it's because what we have found through our research is most net new jobs come from young, high-growth companies. And as we can see from this chart, these young, high-growth companies, during their recession, maintained sort of a higher level of job creation than before, and lost fewer jobs than the large incumbent firms. The thing that this chart does not point out, that I always point out in my presentations, is that dark gray line that is the oldest firms or the older firms. It probably is maybe a dozen or 24 companies that you know of in your community that you could name. And so interacting with them is much more transactional. You know what they want, they can articulate what they need, you can go find them. They're part of an association group, you know, high-ranking officers. However, the young startups, that might be 100 or dozens or scores of firms, and you might be working with one today and it's gone tomorrow, or what they need today changes tomorrow. And so it's a much more highly dynamic group of firms, and servicing them, providing what they need is much more difficult because it's much more dynamic and transient. And so this chart doesn't call that out. The blue line represents a lot more firms than the gray line. So that's sort of the main takeaway of what we say at the Kaufman Foundation is, as a group, as a cohort, your young, high-growth firms are where your new net jobs are created. The sort of mega trends of entrepreneurship, are the new demographics, new map, and new danger. And the thing that's not in this particular presentation is the reality is entrepreneurial starts and successes, the rates of firm starts, churn, firm death, and firm starts, and firm growth are down. They're at historic lows, and we're trending back up again over the past couple of years, but we're still at historic lows. Millennials in particular and younger generations are not starting companies at the same rate that the boomers are or were. Right now, millennials are hitting sort of peak age for firm success. So your typical entrepreneur is not your 21-year-old college dropout in a hoodie. Your typical entrepreneur is 35 to 45, and is a mid-career professional, has connections and things like that. So the new demographics, right? So obviously by 2025, the United States will be a plurality, meaning there will be no majority socio or racial group, and which matters, because essentially if every other demographic started and grew businesses at the same rate as white men, we'd have 1.2 million more businesses and 9.5 million more jobs. 82% of entrepreneurship is white male dominated, and the Kansas City Federal Reserve just came out with a report a week ago. I haven't had time to put it in this presentation, but it was a report on, in particular, women of color, African American women entrepreneurs. African American entrepreneur women represented something like 60% of all high growth companies for all women, and it was like 68% of all African American owned businesses are owned by women. The other problem is that non-minorities are twice as likely to own businesses, employer businesses as minorities. But also the flip side of that is immigrants are twice as likely to start companies than native born. And so immigrants are a great source of entrepreneurship. We need to encourage immigration, foster immigration, and immigrant communities because they're often powered by entrepreneurs. Because of some data issues with this dynamic survey coming out of the census, or I should say not coming out of the census, we've run some focus tests, so this is the basis of the focus test, and we'll kind of get into the data later. But I might call out that business owners of startups typically are trending are age 18 to 44, and they're Black or Hispanic, and they're Democratic, whereas the older businesses are men, they're white, they're Republican. I really don't know what to make of that, other than it seems to be kind of an interesting demographic shift. It might be illustrative of a larger trend, but I merely call that out because, again, it goes back to the demographic story. The new map. We have the top 10 sort of entrepreneurial ecosystem metros. 6 are in the middle of the country. There are the 6 that are colored here, right? St. Louis, Kansas City, Cincinnati, San Antonio, Raleigh, and Dallas-Fort Worth. What's not mentioned in this slide is the reality that the other 4 that are on the coast, so Los Angeles, San Jose, so the Valley, Boston, and San Diego, and I would say Dallas and Houston, probably Austin and New York. The top 5 metros far outstrip all these 6 on this that are called out in this list, right? So we have the income inequality at the individual level. We have firm inequality, so the larger incumbent firms are taking up larger sections of market share, but also there's city inequality. And while cities overall are generally doing much better than rural areas, the top 5 cities are far outstripping everyone else. So 20 years ago, the top 25 cities had 50% of all startups. Now the top 5 cities have 50% of all startups. So certain cities are enjoying a greater share of the startups. And again, this is sort of the concentration effect. Everything's getting concentrated into the winners at every level: firm, individual, city, regional. It's becoming a more and more winner-take-all. Part of that is probably technology. I think a lot of it has to do with politics. We won't get into the details of that right now, but we can later. So the final sort of trend is the new nature of entrepreneurship. And this is sort of a technology piece, which is, in 1962, Eastman Kodak employed 75,000 people when it reached $8 billion in revenue in today's dollars. When Facebook hit the same revenue mark, it only employed 6,300 people. The reality is that firms can achieve more with fewer people. And also with things like Uber and Airbnb, it's hard to tell who is an employee, who's not, who's an entrepreneur, who's not. We're sourcing that out. We're attempting to source that out through our research and through our understandings, but it's tricky. Again, policy comes into play, but also, how do you define entrepreneurship? Even at the foundation for entrepreneurship, we have yet to really settle on, I think, a definitive measure of entrepreneurship. Some people say if you eat what you kill, if you're working and you're making money, if you're not working, you're not making money. That's a form of entrepreneurship. I tend to believe to lean towards the more general. Others think you have to have a formal business and employees. I'm not sure what the right measure is, but essentially, companies are doing, the bigger companies in our economy, the biggest companies in our economy are actually a fraction of the size of the biggest companies of the economy 50, 60 years ago. So we're trying to increase rates of entrepreneurship. I usually say starts and successes, meaning starts and scale-ups. I think scale-ups has been a blind spot of the Kauffman Foundation, and we're trying to figure out how we build understanding around scaling up. There are programs out there that we, quite frankly, don't have much to do with that I think are working. Eisenberg's Scale Up Milwaukee, the Scale Up program, I think has some potential. There is also a Kansas City program called Scale Up Kansas City. It's the same name, but different sort of program. There are programs out there, and we're looking into those. So what are some of the barriers to all of this? To understand barriers, we need to take a step back, and we need to understand, okay, what are the basic functions of an entrepreneurial ecosystem? What our research has shown is that entrepreneurs succeed in an ecosystem. An ecosystem is local, it's bounded, it's human, it's relational, it's a network. And this network has an impact on the probability of success for entrepreneurs. But what is the nature of the network? What is the function of that network on a basic atomized level? And Cesar Hidalgo, who wrote the book Why Information Grows, and I cannot highly recommend this book enough. It is a fantastic book. He's a trained physicist at MIT. He's also a Chilean rock star, and I'm not joking. He is a Chilean rock star. But he has a basic statement of information is broken down into two things. So sort of information, what you read in a book, and know-how, how to apply that information. And economies, essentially what they do is you can't know everything in one person, so they break everything you need to know down into different nodes. And so what happens is an economy then has to reconstruct that through those nodes, and that's essentially how an economy works. So in the sense, if we boil this down to entrepreneurship and the ecosystem, one person cannot know what it takes to start and grow a business. In fact, not even 10 or 12 people. It takes dozens of people, and it changes from industry to industry. And each little sort of atomized piece of what it takes to start and grow a business is held within one person or a couple people. So an entrepreneur has to find those people and find them in the right order, and also know to look for those people or pieces of information. And a high-functioning ecosystem will make that clear, make those connections immediately and succinctly, just in time. And so an entrepreneur has to navigate all the pieces it takes and all the networks and all the paths to find each piece of the puzzle in the appropriate time. Of course, obviously, that's not a smooth transition, but that's how we think of an ecosystem, right? And I sometimes say the measure of a healthy ecosystem is getting resources from those that have them to those that need them, and as efficiently as possible. So if we kind of understand that's the basic function, we start seeing what some of the problems and barriers are. The first barrier is generally people don't talk or engage that network at all. And so this is a great panel survey by one Ronnie Chatterjee. He's a grantee of ours. He was on the Council for Economic Advisors during the Obama administration. Now it's at Duke. And essentially, the top bar is everybody thought about starting a business. So that's the one. Then there's a huge drop, 40-some-odd% of people who talked about business with anyone else, period. And then there's an even larger jump for people who just decided to Google it. So basically, we lost 60% of entrepreneurs in the two steps of talking to somebody and Googling. So we might consider that a barrier, or might consider that just natural culling of the herd. If you can't talk to somebody or Google it, maybe you're not that crazy about your own idea. But then we start seeing other barriers, right? only a few people explicitly considered how other firms might respond if you launched the business, created some sort of document, PowerPoint presentation. Something that you might all be dealing with, I think, a lot that we deal with is where is the financing link? Essentially, there is explore financing options with bank investors or grant programs. That was less. That's about 10%. So 90% of entrepreneurs out there didn't even ask for money, essentially. And so when we hear entrepreneurs complaining about there's no money in our ecosystem, there's no money, the first question I always ask is, okay, have you produced the document? Have you talked to anybody? And they say, yeah, I've done this. All right, have you asked for money specifically? And, you know, if nobody's asking, if nobody's inquiring, some of these barriers are maybe self-inflicted. But it's just sort of an interesting understanding of sort of some of these barriers from the entrepreneur's perspective. Speaking of which, this is another barrier, which is sort of network, lack of network, right? So first-year startups, they know fewer business owners than older business owners. Okay, so that makes sense, right? The longer you're in it, the more business owners you meet. However, the real issue is if you go down to the bottom one, older businesses, is how many younger businesses do they know? And so what we would want, what we'd see in a healthy ecosystem is first-year startups would know a lot more business owners. You would see that blue line for first-year business owners be larger than 39%. Hopefully what you think is it'd be over half like the older business owners, and that those two groups really need to know each other, because older business owners are going to be some of those individuals that have those atomized pieces of information that they've learned throughout their life and through starting and scaling their businesses, especially if they've survived over 5 years. And you can see it growing as startups get experience, but it's I think it's indicative of a barrier that the startup space, which is sort of dearth of network connection. And then finally, this is sort of, is it harder or easier to start your business? Again, this is from the perception of the startups. I'm going to check to make sure that I'm not getting questions or signals from anybody here. Okay. We're seeing that actually leaving your job, there's some mobility. I think there's some telling things in this data, and it's sort of the three circled, green circled numbers. One is leaving your job to start a business. So if you look at, it's 35% of the young businesses, or 35% of the younger businesses think it's harder. 22% of the older businesses thinks it's harder, business owners. And then moving to a new city or state, again, harder for younger business owners than it is for older businesses. And really that jives with sort of larger labor mobility issues in general, which is it's harder to move. Fewer people are moving to economic opportunities. In fact, some of the larger economic hubs are losing people for the first time ever. Silicon Valley is losing people, seeing the population decline as opposed to grow. And also, people aren't leaving their jobs to start businesses. Our hunch at the Gotham Foundation is these are sort of macro policy and economic trends, right? You see millennials graduating with larger debt burdens. They're more financially insecure for much longer in their lives. They can't afford housing. Wages are stagnant. People can't save. And then, of course, healthcare costs. So stagnant wages, increase in healthcare, and increased education, increase in housing are going to depress economic mobility and risk-taking. And, of course, paying your business taxes. Most people think it's the same, although generally people think that this is sort of setting up the business. What are the most difficult issues of setting up your business? Paying benefits to employees, setting up employee HR packages, obtaining the necessary licensing, paying your business taxes, and insuring your business. What I tell mayors, and so might be good, helpful background here, is I run our mayor's conference. This last year we had a mayor's conference in Kansas City for the first time in 6 years. Normally we take it to a different city. We had 120 cities represented and 102 mayors present. And what we tell them is the first order of business is stop doing harm. First do no harm. And coming from a mayoral office, it's not that there isn't a legitimate public mandate for almost everything that a regulation or a license or an ordinance or something. There is always a legitimate mandate for it. But we have to realize a couple things. One is compliance costs on entrepreneurs. Even though they're following the same compliance as a large company, the compliance cost is much larger because the entrepreneur is taking time away. Their time is a much more finite resource, and it costs them a lot more to comply. So it's not even that, let's say, the business tax itself, the gross amount is a lot. It's that if they can go to a city, state, and county, and those are all different intakes, those are all different areas, those are all different interfaces, that's complexity. So the rate might be low or might be high, but in general, it's the complexity that's the problem. So, again, we see this like the most entrepreneurial cities in the country are in some of the most highly taxed jurisdictions in the country as well. And so really the advantage is you can only lower taxes so far. Really, you should make taxes easier to pay. And that goes along with all other regulatory regimes too, right? So if you could recognize other states' permitting and licensing, occupational licensing, that would be helpful. So then essentially what we're trying to get to is the new economic development. We think that principles, cultures, tools, and metrics and practical, research-backed, scalable ideas it's incumbent on organizations like the Kauffman Foundation produce these. Quite frankly, we can talk fluff about, it's about people, it's about connections, it's about networks. But in the end, the reality is economic development professionals and the elected officials, the answer to, they have to point to something. And it's difficult for a mayor to stand up and say, my fellow Kansas Cityans, this year we increased trust by 20%. Isn't that great? The reality is that might be great. And, somebody like Mayor Tate has gone on a kindness campaign. But also, we need to show that this is connected to economic growth, that it matters, that it's important. And we also need to at least begin to understand the beginnings of how we affect and change those sort of sentiment, trust, cohesion, network effects, how we're changing those through programmatic inputs. And so we're working on that, right? We haven't developed that, and that's sort of always been the pushback is, yeah, you tell me this is important, but how do we get our hands around it? And we hope that we can engage with partners like yourselves to push this. We don't have the answers. We don't claim to have the answers, but we do know that the answers will come from communities. And what we want to do is run alongside and provide resources and research and policy and convening power to those doing the work and support that work. So this is where I get into sort of the incentives, sort of transactional reality of economic development. And I want to caveat this as sort of built from what I've seen and what I've developed on my own. And we have yet to sort of really build rigor around these suggestions, but I think they're good for what it's worth. I think they're great because I thought of them, of course. So it comes down to, oftentimes, the argument comes down to, I think economic development professionals here, don't incentivize, don't give incentives to the large incumbent firms. That's not who creates jobs. It's a waste of money. It doesn't do anything. We're just handing over the piggy bank to these companies. They're bilking us. And, it's always a more nuanced reality than that. I don't have to explain this to you all understand it. And so for me, I've always said to economic development professionals and mayors and policymakers, listen, I understand that competitive opportunities are something you need to take advantage of for a lot of reasons. And I do think that large incumbent firms have a very important role to play in the ecosystems in entrepreneurs' lives. And it is generally as a support mechanism. And so what I tell economic development professionals is to think about it like this. If we're going to incentivize and entice and compete for incumbent firms, large incumbent firms, we're going to give incentives. Don't give it to them for job creation. That's not the metric that matters. In fact, they're not technically creating jobs. What we should incentivize incumbents to do is do the things that only incumbents can do and that are important to entrepreneurial ecosystems, which is mentor local entrepreneurship, mentor connections, that network connections, right? All the C-level folks, or all the highest ranking folks in that company, in your ecosystem, should all be required to have a mentee of a local entrepreneur. Hopefully one that comes from a marginalized, underserved community, person of color, woman, immigrant, LGBTQ. Second is procure from local entrepreneurs. They should be, as part of the incentive factor package, be procuring as much as they can from local entrepreneurs. And that's a program that many EDCs, I think, are entertaining and working on and could facilitate easily. They should invest in angel group species, CDFIs. This, again, high-ranking people should be part of the angel network. The corporation should have a corporate VC or partner with a local VC, regional VC, and CDFIs clearly, that's another avenue. You should have subject matter experts in pitch competitions, demo days. We have corporate people coming to Techstars in Kansas City. That's a common saying. Contact Techstars, contact your incubator, contact your accelerator. Go to demo days, pitch days, things like that. They should spin out companies. So there have been a couple of large incumbents recently in Kansas City that have spun out companies and have invested in them and own a large controlling share of the company, but they've technically spun it out. I think that's a very smart move in that it sort of outsources the risk. It becomes its own company. So something innovative that the CEO may or may not be 100% sure on, doesn't want to bet, internal political capital on, can spin it out, still control it, still keep it close, but allow it to live its own life, but maintain close proximity to it as something that might be value additive to the company later. Engage marginalized communities, obviously, and then pass through for specific uses. So if we're incentivizing something we did, again, creatively in Kansas City, is we abated and tipped a lot of the cultural sort of, this area that was sort of seeing a resurgence because of cultural use, artists, visual artists, musicians, theater artists. And what we did is we allowed the landlords to take advantage of the TIF and abatement program, but we said 51% of the use has to be for artists for this research. And we also required that the rents for those uses be kept low, that they pass through the savings to the tenant. I think that this has been an underutilized tool, at least in Kansas City and other locations. Some locations have the ability to do ad valorem sort of incentives like this. Others don't. California, for instance, has lost its TIP ability recently at the local level, which is another discussion. But in general, I would say is that that the economic development community, it is difficult to help entrepreneurs on an individual firm level. It is much easier to think of a systems environmental level where you are looking at systems, network, environment metrics, and not necessarily firm metrics. What we want to remember is churn is good, startup and failure and restartup is good. It needs to be dynamic, it needs to churn. And so when we're thinking about supporting entrepreneurs, we should think of the system at one level, abstract it up, the system, the network level, and not so much the firm level. Unlike traditional economic development, where we're looking at the firm level, we're looking at individual outputs from firms and incentive packages. And that's the final difference. And this field is very early, it's emergent. The research is just beginning to get started. I personally started a research pilot program portfolio to the tune of $3.5 million to build new data that measures this activity at a timely and granular fashion, because quite frankly, the large administrative data sets that the Kauffman Foundation has built with places like the Census Bureau are good for large economic trends, but they're not helpful for policymakers, economic development professionals at the local level. So we're getting there, and we hope that you'll engage with us and be friendly critics and push back and tell us when we're wrong, tell us when what you're seeing on the ground doesn't jive with what we're saying. But I hope this is the beginning of a great conversation, and you can always reach out to us at the Kauffman Foundation, myself, Andy Stahl, Philip Gaskin, Victor Wong. We're all working on this goal, and again, thank you for the opportunity of speaking. And I will go on mute now.
Thank you so much, Evan. And I also want to thank our audience for being patient with the audio. So Evan was gracious to give us his time while he is on the road, and he thought he had a location secured to be able to make this call, and that didn't work out. So those of you who spend a lot of time on the road know what it's like sometimes when you don't get to control your own destiny. So we had gotten a couple of comments on that, and so I just wanted to let you know the reason for that and to thank you for being patient. Also, as an outsider, I just want to comment that Kauffman really is committed to this, to understanding what regions and communities need in order to support their entrepreneurs, and coming into this rather than having we know all the answers, but really rather than that with a real listening mode to understand what you do need and to try to deliver solutions on that. So I'm really excited about their involvement in this. So thank you again, Evan. And so now I'm ready to introduce our next speaker. And our next speaker is Jeff Milanetti. And Jeff is president of Innovative Partners, which is a management consulting firm that has been a leader in the business incubation industry since 1986. He's had a lot of accomplishments in his career, and some of the high points are he founded the Rutgers Business Innovation Center. He served as president and CEO of the New Jersey Entrepreneurs Forum, established and managed Port Tech Los Angeles, and established and managed the Ethiopia Climate Innovation Center. He's also consulted to many academic institutions, providing them with feasibility studies and assessments for incubator programs. And he served on the board of the International Business Innovation Association, most commonly known as NBIA, since 2014. Jeff was also a project manager and an author on the topic of investment readiness in a project to develop new modules of incubator management training for the World Bank. And so this has given him some really interesting international experience. He's a board member of Connect Rwanda, which is a nonprofit organization that plans and manages teacher exchanges between Maryland and Rwanda schools. And so I'm really excited to hear what he has to say about incubators, which play a huge role in our ecosystem. So thank you for joining us today, Jeff. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Penny. See if I can get control of the, there we go. All right, I guess we can move through this quickly. That was a little too quick. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Milanetti, and I thank you, Penny, for introducing me. And I want to talk today about some strategies for supporting startups that are done through the what I have found to be a very interesting medium, that of business incubation. And over the years, I've been involved with a number of them. A quick listing of the things I want to cover here. I'll talk a little bit about incubators, why they're successful, business incubation typology, just to give you a very broad brush look at some of the various kinds of incubators, some best practices in incubation, then we'll sum up, and I'm sure we're going to have plenty of questions when we get going. So let's move on. Jeez. Incubators are great homes for startups. It's estimated by some there are at least 1,200 incubators or entrepreneur support organizations in the US and about 7,000 of them globally. There are many incubator models. We're going to talk about 5 today quickly: incubators, accelerators, co-working spaces, maker spaces, and kitchen incubators, all of which are very commonly known, and but it will give you a flavor of some of the ways in which this model can be applied. Before we do that, I want to make one comment that over the years, and I've unfortunately got many of them in the incubation industry, every time we've done a study at our trade association, the NBIA, before that the NBIA, that looked at the success of small companies, the survival rates of companies that participated in incubation programs was regularly in the mid to high 80s, 80%. So about 87% is the number that I hear most often anymore, and it's quite a contrast when you think about the failure rate of small businesses in this country, some of which have been estimated to be as high as 50%. Now, that's numbers are simply that, and they're only as good as the reporting that you get. But this 1% of survivability has been consistent for all the years I've been doing this. Well, let's look quickly at some incubator types. And we'll talk about these 5 different types of incubators. The traditional one, which is at the top of this chart, I hope you can read it, is the standard thing you think of when you consider an incubation program. They have some entry criteria. Those couldn't be set locally. Maybe you want companies that have some revenues. Maybe you want companies that have a year or two of experience. It's all variable, and every incubator business model is different. Generally, tenure of incubation companies is anywhere from 1 to 3 years, sometimes a little more. Rents and service fees are going to be based on the local rates. But the big key to incubation that I think I truly believe in, and I think has been important in my experience, and that is access to finance, the training that comes with being in an incubator, a good solid training program, the mentorship one can receive either from business counselors or from actual one-on-one mentors or advisory boards. Those things are truly helpful, as I see it, to entrepreneurs in growing their businesses. You can compare that with the second line here, the accelerator, which is a certain type of incubator, typically having a much shorter period of time, 3 to 6 months, giving up equity, which incubation programs generally do not. There are some that do. And that's a fair percent, 6 to 10% of equity, and some accelerator programs also charge fees, but you get much more intensive training over a fairly short period of time, and you get something that may take an incubator client years to get, and that is rapid product validation. The whole idea of finding out if that product has a chance of making it in the market. And so we think of accelerators as more or less a pre-incubation phase, but it can be, it fits right into the continuum of incubating companies over a 1 to 3 year period. The next group is the co-working space, which is the least interactive with entrepreneurs. I mean, startup entrepreneurs might be there, but also people just looking for an office outside the home, who are willing to pay a few dollars for some desk space, maybe a good high-speed internet connection, the ability to rent a conference space. The tenure varies. 1 to 2 years is fairly typical, according to at least one source I've seen, and about $150 a month is a reasonable amount to pay for it, I guess. The next category is a makerspace, which I think of as a co-working space with tools. They're a lot more fun. They generally don't have entry criteria, but they often sell memberships, and an average price to be in a makerspace might be $45 to $75 a month. One of the most fun maker spaces I've ever seen is the first Fab Lab that MIT put together. It's in South Boston, and it had access to high-speed internet. It had computers. It now has 3D printers, laser cutters. I don't know if that particular one had a CNC machine, but the ability to put together prototypes, to be creative. When I visited the Fab Lab in South Boston, there was somebody there making jewelry. There was somebody composing music. There were after-school classes for youth. Lots of opportunities, and they don't cost a lot. And the fifth one we'll talk about for a minute here is a kitchen incubator, catering primarily to small batch cooks, people who want to sell homemade products, cottage industry kinds of food products, and others along the food value chain. They may have competitive entry. It really depends on the location. I saw one kitchen incubator that reported 4 to 6 years to complete their program of training. And it's typical to spend about $20 to $25 an hour for the commercial kitchen. This is an awfully good deal for people who are trying to support themselves by selling small batches of food and at the same time having access to a USDA certified kitchen, which is quite expensive to make. So we'll look at those 5, I think, would be representative of the entire sector, but they are just examples. There are as many business models for incubators as there are incubators, quite honestly. Everybody does things differently. As a strategy, business incubation has been pretty effective over the 30 years or so that I've been familiar with it. Some of the, in some places, the incubator can serve as a gathering place. It can be a residence for young businesses who are surrounded by the tools and resources they need, but also they often don't realize that those resources can be useful to them until they've been there a while, and often they don't have the revenues to pay for them in any event. But it is truly, for economic developers, an incubation program is an example of entrepreneurship in action. I mean, it is there in the community and can be used to attract visitors. It can be used to show off how the economic development organization is serving the needs of entrepreneurs. It can, of course, develop relationships with related organizations like science parks, innovation hubs, and so forth. Incubators often are designed to meet specific economic goals. For example, industry cluster development. There used to be plenty of industry clusters in the upper Midwest serving the automobile industry. We saw some incubators that were formed in the late 90s and early part of 2000 as people began to try and recover the resources that had been put into these factories and the training of people to work in them, and change or retarget the kinds of products they were making so that they could develop a cluster of companies that might change, instead of making batteries for automobiles, perhaps started making batteries for electric vehicles. They create youth employment opportunities. We have seen incubators in urban areas that give an opportunity for youth to find pursuits that help teach them self-reliance, the value of being self-employed, and some of those have been successful. They're very important in encouraging the growth of women-owned businesses. Now, if you look at organizations or at reports such as a recent one by Amex, it says that women-owned business ownership is now 39%, but only 7%, they're responsible for only 7% of the revenues, which would lead me to believe that those are, in most cases, small businesses and likely candidates for incubation programs. So if an economic rationale, or if an economic strategy for your area says we really need to encourage women-owned businesses, certainly that would be in favor of starting an incubation program. Protecting the environment, it's interesting that I've run 2 incubation programs in the last 10 years or so that were oriented towards green and clean technology. In the Port of LA, for example, we had an incubator called Port Tech Los Angeles, entirely devoted to reducing the carbon footprint, cleaning the air, and making it possible to reduce the amount of pollution in the environment there in Los Angeles. If I'll digress on that for just a moment to say, in a port, any port, but especially an active container port like Los Angeles, everything is run by a diesel engine, and efforts are made to nibble away at that, but by introducing trucks that aren't diesel trucks, that are powered by batteries, by having ships switch from their diesel generators and diesel engines to shore power. But the cranes that run that lift the containers, the railroads that run the containers in and out, as well as many of the trucks, diesel engines, every single one. And this is the kind of very targeted incubator that can do some very good things by encouraging the development of technologies that will mitigate the pollution. Many incubators have something called soft landings programs, which are used for attracting foreign entrepreneurs and maybe foreign investors, sometimes local investors. But the point is, soft landings gives an opportunity for an incubation program to bring in goods that they might not be able to have otherwise. Entrepreneurs find them attractive because the incubator rents are generally quite reasonable. I know that the New Jersey Institute of Technology, as an example, has the Enterprise Development Center, which has been a soft landings incubator for about 10 years. And they regularly have new clients each year that want to take advantage of the location, the services. They have their own, the Enterprise Development Center has their own investment fund. And putting all those things together, plus being a 15-minute train ride into New York, makes it a very attractive place to be. And lastly, of course, incubators can help stimulate more and better linkages between the business community and academia. 32% of incubation programs are related to an academic institution, so that's a pretty important thing. As we design an incubation program, the first thing that anyone says anymore is it has to be sustainable. Now, that means that it really needs to have some fiscal and managerial accountability, that there are KPIs that are achievable by management, and most important, the thing that often gets incubators into trouble, that the budgeting contains enough money to meet the true costs of the program. As young businesses, which most of them are, incubators, like their clients, often underestimate the real costs of operation, and that can be a challenge to economic development organizations that are funding them or starting them or being involved with them in some way. Some of the ways of segmenting incubation purposes, we have single purpose incubators such as the New Jersey Economic Development Authority's Commercialization Center for Innovative Technologies, a wonderful life sciences incubator for companies that are serving New Jersey's pharmaceutical and life science zone. Multi-purpose incubators, the kind you think of when someone says, let's start an incubator, well, we're usually talking about the mixed use, all kinds of strategy or all kinds of businesses. And really that can be a challenge as well, because it requires a fair amount of experience in a very broad base of businesses. So sometimes that is harder than it looks. Centrally located incubators, that have outreach centers can be very effective. West Texas A&M University in Amarillo, Texas has had one for about 10 years. They have remote locations where they deliver services to the entrepreneurs, and then the main incubator is near the campus and allows them to operate as a regular incubator there with the services for the remote locations in addition. And we saw that in when I was in Ethiopia, we had exactly the same sort of situation where in Addis Ababa, the capital, we have an incubator, but in in several remote cities, we set up outreach centers to allow us to provide services to the entrepreneurs. So it's been effective in a couple of places, at least in my personal experience. Now, incubators truly contribute to the community and participate in the ecosystem. They create employment, they contribute to the local economy, they're buying goods and services, they're providing mentor opportunities, they're borrowing money, they're training, they're buying gasoline for their cars. They are members of the community. Many other kinds of incubation models do not have the same sort of long-term residential intent. And so incubators can be they can become leaders. They can become the go-to place for local entrepreneurship, programming and services. And that's a good role to have. You can have the SBDC there, you can have MBA student groups working with the entrepreneurs, you can hold public meetings there. Those kinds of things make the incubator visible and at the same time attractive, because citizens can see that their friends and their neighbors, their fellow business people have the ability to do business in a location that is actually helping the community. Preparing the community for entrepreneurship means in many cases developing awareness by providing through the incubator the opportunities for collaborating with local small businesses, for engaging with the community by linking other members of the ecosystem and understanding the value of innovation and entrepreneurship, making it a focal point of community-led economic development. The ecosystem is extremely important because every client in an incubation program is going to have some interaction with other members of the local ecosystem. And one of the great things that an incubator manager can do to help make the program successful is to get out and network and get to know all the other members in that ecosystem. And I'm thinking about the service providers, the capital providers, the trainers, the consultants, the accountants who make these, who allow the business to operate successfully, and by their contribution to the I mean, they get business from the incubator, but they can also provide valuable services to it. I want to look at a couple of best practices in incubator development. In the case of formation of the incubator, the first thing that comes to my mind is to start with the end in mind, to have a vision, to understand where you want to be in 5 years and 10 years, and then to work your way back to what steps have to be taken in order to get to that spot. It is extremely important to conduct a feasibility study. I had an incubation experience at one point where I took over a new incubator and found out there was no feasibility study that had been done, and I had to lose, I didn't have to, but I lost a fair amount of time hiring one of my competitors to come in and do a feasibility study, give me the results so that I could use it to go out for more funding as evidence that it was in fact a good program. Well, those things happen, there's a lesson learned, but it would not be the recommended procedure if I was advising you to do that. It's important to recruit a champion, the person who can stay at who can lead the organization, a formation committee or something, to really make the incubator a reality. Somewhere in every group of people who are trying to put together an incubation program, there is someone out there that needs to be in charge and has the ability to connect the incubator with the kinds of with the folks that need to be persuaded that this is a reasonable idea. And last of all, and probably most important, is to design for sustainability, because grants do expire, money does go away, and it is very important for an incubator to know when that's going to happen and to plan accordingly. From the perspective of management of an incubation program, it's a great idea to select an experienced manager, or at least provide enough funding to train that person. It's good to participate in the various trade associations. They produce sources of contacts. They produce access to the thought leaders of an industry, and a good way for managers and board members and sponsors to understand just what's being talked about in the industry. And my gosh, Kauffman is probably one of the most important as a source of information for us in the incubation industry. And of course, I think it's pretty obvious you have to treat an incubation program as a business. And sound management can never be replaced by good intentions. In terms of selecting clients, I'll just say very quickly, you need a process, you need to define your criteria. It's a good idea, in my experience, to have a written application as well as an interview by the committee. The written application will give some details, but you really don't get to know what's on an entrepreneur's mind until you've sat down with him or her and talked about what they really want to do. Good to recruit an admissions committee to help make those decisions, and you can see the membership listed there. Our recommendations for what members ought to be included. Operations, an incubation program should be the example of efficient business operations, which is why we think it's important to have experience management. This is very common advice. Execute a business plan, train the clients, work that ecosystem, network constantly with the members of that ecosystem because of the referrals they can make and their ability to help the incubation clients be successful, as well as the incubator itself. I think training is extremely important for the entrepreneurs, and that training can be delivered by local experts who are good resources for it. We always call these the must-haves: the access to financing, the access to information, and these are pretty much self-explanatory: access to markets, access to mentorship. The mentorship programs, I'm grouping those together, but really that's more than just having a relationship with some mentors who work with the individual companies. It's also boards of advisors. It's interactions with the other members of the ecosystem. It is the counseling by the management. All of those things together can help make for successful companies. And I think we covered the ecosystem fairly well before. We'll just keep moving here. If you do use consultants in developing your incubation program, just think of some of the things that they can do to help you in terms of identifying services gaps, helping to make stronger linkages between the public, private, and academic sectors. As we said a few moments ago, 32% of those incubators are academic institution sponsors, have academic institution sponsors. So good to have those relationships. Providing technical and advisory services. These are obvious things that consultants do. I won't, you can read it. Be happy to send this to you if you want to see it. Before starting an incubation program, having thought about what we've just talked about here, ask yourself, is this project feasible and sustainable? And are there entrepreneurs out there that really want these kinds of services? You know, what are their needs? And you only find these things out by surveys and interviews and talking to them on a regular basis. And I would not ever consider sponsoring an incubation program if it was only going to be for less than a year. And even that would really be taking quite a risk. Incubation invariably requires sponsorship of various kinds, and it is not really a good idea to develop an incubator with the idea that it's only going to be funded for the next year or two. Once again, it's important to lead the project and discover who that champion is going to be, and then what should be the next steps. So summing up, these are things we've talked about here as we went along. I think the key is to remember that there are so many different kinds and so many business models. It takes time to figure out which one fits the particular set of conditions that you have in your location. So if you're going to start an incubator, it's really important to take the time to study that, to have a feasibility study, to get help if you don't have experience with it, and try to have the must-haves. Certainly have a champion. And remember my final piece there, good intentions should not replace sound management. It's got to be run as a business. I guess I'll be very happy to answer any other questions you have. Here's my phone number if you wish to call me.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was one of the better presentations that I've heard on incubators, particularly around how we prepare for them. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. I also want to remind our audience that this is a great time for you to put your question box. I can watch those as they come up. As both of our panelists were talking, I've jotted down some questions of my own. And so I will go ahead and start out since I don't see any questions coming up immediately, and hopefully some of the things that I asked will spur you to put some of your questions on as well, or maybe to build on some of the questions that I have, because we really want this to be interactive with your thoughts in mind. So I'm going to put this out to both of our panelists, both to Evan and Jeff. And so we're talking in this webinar about what's your strategy? And I want to get to that in a minute, but I think where a lot of folks get tripped up is, like I said in the beginning, a lot of this is not transactional. As Evan said, a lot of it is relationships and more relational. And so how do you measure this? And this is just a question that comes up so often. I know SourceLink is tackling some of this, but how do we as economic development, entrepreneur support organizations, when our boards or our audience says, oh, okay, we've given you this much money, now what have you done? Mm-hmm. How do you measure inside ecosystems? Who'd like to take a shot at that one?
Well, this is Jeff. I think the thing to do is, if you're going to measure, what we usually look at are not quite as deep as one might think, because we assume that if, for example, one is creating jobs, that's nice, and it's a nice KPI to have, that so many companies have been recruited, so many jobs were created, the dollars that were allocated in the budget were spent this way and that way. But there are some things are a little bit more difficult to, or a little bit more detailed. And one of the things that comes to me, or some of the things we've looked at before, are year-on-year progress of the companies. In other words, do they have more contracts? Have they had higher sales? Have they hired more people? Have they created more jobs individually? So that we can, I mean, when Evan talks about granularity, he's talking about real granularity. I'm talking about something that isn't quite as detailed as that. But these are important measurements that are used in the incubation industry, at least. Year-on-year contracts, revenues of the companies. We look at the efficiency of the companies in spending their money. In other words, if revenues were at one level, but the cost of goods has, if revenues increase but the cost of goods does not, at least we might assume that the company is being more efficient and is in effect developing into a more mature and better company, better able to handle the financial details. And how many companies got SBIR contracts? How many, if it's strictly a technology incubator, how many companies have filed patents or been awarded a patent? So those are some of the kinds of things that we look at in incubation. I'm sure that Evan can give us a much better idea in in the larger environment.
Yeah, Evan, what kind of experience do you have in that, or what have you seen in measurement?
So I think what Jeffrey mentioned is right on, as far as being able to sort of collect what we can now. So there are like three things going on in measuring local economies and ecosystems. One is, what can we measure right now? And Jeffrey named off a bunch of things that we can measure right now. I think, again, SourceLink, Kansas City SourceLink is a good place to go to sort of see data standards, best practices on how to capture those early indicator top-level metrics that are very valuable. And Jeffrey, I would also encourage everybody to ask Jeffrey, how are some of the things you're capturing with sort of business revenue? And I don't know if your organization shares those or not, but that'd be great. That's a great data point to capture. Those are things we can capture now, that we have the infrastructure now. The second thing is, what do we need to be captured in the future? What do we really want to be measuring? That maybe we can measure now or can't measure now, but what are the ideal things to be measuring? Well, we want to be able to measure sort of time to success, right? From the moment somebody has an idea to the moment they succeed. Of course, we can measure that through an aggregate of things, but we don't really have the infrastructure yet. Or some social networks. So we're developing network analysis based on other sort of network analysis from other fields. Ted Zoller, Marion Feldman from the UNC have done some of this work. I'm funding, like I said, my pilot, my research pilot program is our delving into data sets and data infrastructure. We're getting into computer science scraping, predictive algorithms, large but granular data sets, private data sets like Stripe, Square, Burning Glass, Yelp, Etsy. We're dabbling in those areas because they are both representative and also, hyper granular. And really what this is okay, we know what we want to do in the future, and now we have to build our infrastructure to get there. And so I think the first step is to really sort of begin to uniformly start collecting the things Jeffrey mentioned in a way that has sort of like standard practices. Again, I don't think that really exists yet. And I think KC SourceLink is a leader in that. Not to sort of, they are a long time and current grantee of ours, so caveat, we think they're great. But I don't think Maria or crew would say that they're the end all be all. I think it would be I think it'd be a huge step forward for sort of economic development professionals to start developing, what are standards that work for them. Because like you said, Penny, you're on the board. Somebody gave you money. What's happening? And it's hard to say, well, our network looks really good. That might be great. But again, I admit the sort of shortcoming of we don't have an adequate, articulate way of sort of having a compelling data point around that as to sort of direct correlations to why that matters to entrepreneur success. Mm-hmm. So we're building that. And I think what we have to do, I think the punchline of this is sort of standardize what we're doing, sort of build that standard, but then also begin to really get creative with different data sources, different metrics. So my final example is I funded an organization at NYU run by Julia Lane. Julia Lane created, along with the Kauffman Foundation and the Census Bureau, Longitudinal Employment Household Dynamics, which is LEHD, which has public MSA level data, which is very useful economic data. So she creates large data sets. So now she's looking at the cloud to get micro level data from incumbents. And the point of this is, or from local governments, the point is she basically in this project that I funded found that water data from the water service department actually was very indicative of firm start and success and death. She looked at water data. As random and as crazy as that sounds, that actually might be one of the more promising metrics we've come across in the last couple of years. Totally out of left field. It wouldn't have been possible had it not been for the creativity of the people in Kansas City. This pilot took place in Kansas City. The data owners, the water department, Julia, entrepreneurs, people kind of hacking things together. So I think really it's an open field. I guess, this is going to be a co-collaboration with folks like yourself and entrepreneurial ecosystem builders and things like that. But we're building it.
Yes, and thanks for great input from both of you. And I agree, this is something that we're, building as we go along. In many ways, this feels very new. And for economic developers and some entrepreneur support organizations, for so long, we have been judged on jobs. How many jobs? How many jobs? And I've never met an entrepreneur who said, my goal is to create jobs. And so sometimes when companies get more efficient, they spin off jobs. And so I think it's great to think about really different ways to measure and then, to let our stakeholders know what those measurements are. And then it is so important to keep them informed about, how we're meeting those goals. Chris Gibbons, who founded Economic Gardening out of Littleton, Colorado, talks about it, and he calls it drip irrigation. How do we keep telling our funders and our stakeholders what we have done to be successful, that power of storytelling and the metrics that we have come up with. So just reminding everybody that this is the time to put your questions in. I don't see any questions on my board. Delaney, if you see any on yours, let me know. So I'm just going to continue chatting away here and see if maybe this spurs some other folks. So, as we've been talking about, this is a bit different, and we're really looking for a balance. So there's really no panacea. Economic development isn't all about recruiting 100% of the time. It's not all about entrepreneurship 100% of the time. It's about a balance. But I think sometimes what I have experienced and what I've seen other entrepreneur support organizations experience is we work so hard to develop the community, to get our entrepreneurs on board, get those mentors in place, put in good networking. And then how do we take that next step to influence the mindset? So first of all, sometimes we have to influence the mindset of our own community, but more importantly, our legislators and our policymakers. And this has been challenging in a lot of different areas to get legislators and policymakers to really pay attention to the value of entrepreneurship, to the stickiness that comes from job creation, to how it affects the tax base, how it affects everything from, as Evan said, water data to the school system to whatever. And so, Evan, I'm going to put this to you first because you do a lot of work in the realm of policy. How do we go about trying to change the mindset or affect the mindset of our policymakers and our legislators?
So I think the first thing we say is the first slide of my presentation, which is most net new jobs almost all net new jobs come from young, high growth firms. Now, the really smart policymakers catch us on that argument and say, of course that's true. That's like saying all net new humans come from births. Of course, they're not being spawned from pods, right? That's almost a logical tautology, right? The only place new jobs can possibly come from that are not, a wash from one incumbent losing to another incumbent gaining, or the same incumbent losing and gaining within, a certain period of time, are new companies. And so you enter in that conversation and say, okay, but if you have that argument with somebody and say, of course, that's where they all come from, you say, then that the only place you can ever create new jobs is through entrepreneurship, right? So it's a sort of convoluted way to sort of articulate the argument, or not the argument, but sort of the back and forth you have with policymakers. Because the reality is that entrepreneurship is hard to support. It takes a long time to produce jobs, if it ever produces jobs. And it is uncertain and it is amorphous. And so you have to kind of stick to this idea of, listen, the basic function of entrepreneurship is to create better communities. And even failed firms create better communities. They create energy, they create dynamism, and they create hope and inspiration. And that might seem fluffy, but it is precisely the sort of people that turn a community around. And almost all communities, whether large or small, have a group of people that are hustling, that are working, that are putting back into the community. And you can always sort of describe that person generally to a policymaker, and then they can identify it personally. And you say, people who might be kind of frustrating at times, might not listen, might not understand the big picture, but they're in there, they care, and they're working. And they themselves might not ever create a firm that produces a bunch of jobs, but they will create an environment and ecosystem by which firms and communities are built, desirability is created. And we do genealogy studies of, and we're developing a methodology to understand genealogies of ecosystems. And we've done a couple. We've done the Research Triangle, we've done Austin. And inevitably, what happens is, and Ed Glazer did New York and Detroit on his own, what happens is there's this economy going in the community, it's going along and so along, it suffers an exogenous shock, it suffers a downturn. And the community that had a relatively robust layer of entrepreneurial support system, activities, some bare minimum stuff, that bare minimum infrastructure takes all the resources that were released by that exogenous shock. In the case of the Research Triangle, it's GlaxoSmithKline. In the case of Austin, it was a couple things. It was decreasing fin spinning. It was a sort of a consortium of chip manufacturers. But essentially what happens is the community has ecosystem entrepreneur builders or ecosystem builders that aren't doing much. It seems sort of dormant. And this injection of resources gets put into this dormant sort of infrastructure, and it explodes. All this activity starts happening because you have human capital, people leaving jobs, people needing to do something. And so they have no real choice but to start a company. And when there's a support mechanism there, it's a sort of shots on goal approach. And so really the final argument is, listen, it's necessary to create new jobs, it's an innate human activity, and somebody in your community is already doing it. And finally, if you can build just a basic infrastructure, when things go poorly, that's the thing that creates a robust ecosystem that can respond to the downturn, be it economic, be it industry, be it whatever. Entrepreneurship is the thing that sort of triggers them when the situation is not great. So like half of Fortune 500 companies were all formed during recession years, but like that only represents 20% of the years. So you see like an outsized representation of entrepreneurship in recession years. And so in the end, that's the final argument of things are going to get bad. It's the entrepreneurs that pull you through. If you have a structure to accept that, to accept the resources when things get bad, you have an infrastructure by which you can pull your community out of into a downturn. And that sort of gets them thinking. That sort of entices them, I think, as a way to say, hey, these are the basic three arguments.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And, if anybody in the audience has, a way that they work with their legislators, policymakers that you want to share it on your evaluation or share it with IEDC, because everywhere I go, this comes up. We're working so hard. We're doing great things. How do we get our legislators to pay attention? How do we get our governor to pay attention to how important this is? So thank you for that. So Jeff, my next question is for you. So, so Evan had mentioned in his presentation about how important it is to think about scale-ups, to think about how we help our companies grow. And it seems like so often when we start to talk about ecosystems, we talk pretty much exclusively about startups. But we also need the growth companies involved because they're a great help for startups, but they need help themselves, and sometimes they don't really feel as loved as the startups. So a lot of times, at least when I think of incubators, accelerators, I really line them up in my head with startups. Is that a true and fair statement? And if it is not, how do you see incubators playing a role in helping companies scale and then helping them once they have scaled up to a successful growth company?
The way I would look at it is that the incubator is going to have one of the key aspects of a comprehensive incubation program is to have a program for the graduate companies, so that when when the company leaves the incubator, when they graduate, they still have a relationship with the incubator. They still participate in what is going on, but they're more divorced from it because now that they've found their feet, they are trying to run. And having events that support them, having opportunities for them to participate in, let's say, the equivalent of a demo day, expos, that sort of thing, I think are very good tactics to help these graduate companies keep moving forward and hopefully at a rapid rate. It's funny, the accelerator term, when we started the incubation process years ago, accelerators were companies that worked with the graduates, the ones that took graduates from $500,000 a year to $2 million a year or more, which in 20 years ago that was a lot of money. But the point is, accelerator as a term was appropriated by some investors several years ago now, to mean what we would almost consider pre-incubation. And so accelerate to me still means help a company that wants to scale up make that jump. And at a certain, I at one time, well, for many years, I ran something called the New Jersey Entrepreneurs Forum, the whole purpose of which was to work with companies that were a little further along than your standard incubation clients, and that had a program where each month we met and had a little bit about business management, a lot about pitching and finding investors and care and feeding of investors and how you interact with them, and networking and opportunities that to meet the people that could propel that company to the next level, whatever it is. And we use that in most respects to meet our, what we considered to be our graduate requirements, because it gave everybody, not only the startups, but those that were a little beyond that, the chance to participate.
I appreciate that. And I want to apologize to our participants. Your questions just now popped up on my screen. So that's why I have not been asking them, is they weren't there until just a second ago. So I'm going to try to get to as many of these as possible. And again, I am so sorry. So John want to ask a great question here. And I'm going to put this to Jeff. So if you could design an all-day workshop for entrepreneurs, what would be the top 3 topics you would have in that workshop?
Well, I could be cute and say finance, finance, and finance, but invariably when I talk to the entrepreneurs in the organizations, in the incubation organizations that I've run, finance is always number 1. It's generally not really as big a problem as they make it sound, but that's the first thing they think of. I think the second thing I would go with would be the training, because especially at the level of companies and incubators, the amount of business knowledge is seldom as great as is reported. And I found that out running a training program in the last Climate Innovation Center when we started doing pre and post tests for our training program, and discovered that entrepreneurs didn't have as much business experience as we thought they had. So I would definitely rank training to be a second priority, and certainly in a third priority, I guess it would be something that would allow them to learn how to network and interact with the folks that can fund them and can help them find the resources they need to grow. A lot of particularly technology entrepreneurs are not as perhaps as used to dealing with groups and dealing with folks they don't know very well. And so there's some social skills sometimes that need to be part of the training, but learning how to present is certainly a very important skill to have, because you will be doing that for the rest of your life, whether you're an entrepreneur or in some other profession. You always have to at least be able to describe what you do and how you do it. And this was a very big piece of our Entrepreneur Forum curriculum. We always had and made people jump up and have to introduce themselves and to talk about what their business is and do elevator pitches. Those are important skills too, because you won't get the financing that you're talking about if you don't have the ability to articulate what it is that you're doing. So that go ahead.
No, wonderful. Thank you. Those are great topics. And then Jeff, also particularly for you, Tiffany Rainey has a question on, you had mentioned finding somebody to do a feasibility study for an incubator. How do you go about finding that kind of person to do a feasibility study?
Our Incubation Trade Association, the International Business Innovation Association, maintains a list of consultants that will do that kind of work. It includes my company, by the way, but that's easy to do. It is not hard to find, to get access to a list of folks that can do this kind of work. And NBIA would, for an incubator, NBIA would be my first choice. Other than that, there are so many. I mean, I'm sure that IEDC has a list. The other trade associations that serve entrepreneurs in one format or another, whether it's incubation or not, like National Association of Community College Entrepreneurs, SSTI, State Science and Tech Institute. I mean, there are many organizations that can make recommendations about entrepreneurs excuse me, about consultants that work with organizations that want to start an incubation or acceleration program.
Wonderful, thank you. And Delaney from IDC, I hope we can go a few extra minutes since I'm just now getting to some of these questions. I've got a couple of more. So Aaron Cole asked a really great question. I'm going to put this to Evan. So how do you find potential entrepreneurs in a smaller community that doesn't currently have any incubators or small business services? How do you find them, Evan?
It's a great question. We've been, I think, lax in our sort of smaller community rural approach, if I can take the liberty of assuming that's sort of the gist of it. I would say one of our grantees, Network Kansas, has taken a statewide approach, and really what I think happens where you find success is from a regional play, right? So some of our data shows that like there's some threshold of population associated with an economic or entrepreneurial ecosystem. And so whether you reach that population threshold in a city, in a singular sort of dense place, or if it's across a region, you need to achieve some sort of level of population. And so Western Kansas doesn't have a huge amount of population, so they have to sort of cobble together larger regions, larger geographic areas. And I think a regional, if you all have regional associations that you belong to, that would be the first step, which is, contact your regional folks, find out what's going on, contact your SBAs, contact your regional EDA representative, but then also, go to your, Jeffrey spoke about sort of academic institutions being attached to incubators. Go to your local academic institutions, go to your, if you have junior colleges, community colleges, go there and look for entrepreneurs. Those are generally places that you'll find them, but you may have to go to a regional play. And that seems to be showing some success at Network Kansas. You can find them, I think, on our website, or definitely look them up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they really do a great job. We work with them a lot at the foundation. So AJ Ferguson has a really interesting question. I'm going to pose this to both Evan and Jeff. And any standout examples of entrepreneurial ecosystem leaders connecting with social service or community development ecosystem in a local community? And this would be in an effort to pull new socioeconomic groups into business ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll take the first whack at this one. So one of our grantees, Defy, I can't give the whole name, it's not my grantee personally, but essentially they are operating as a reentry mechanism for returning citizens. And often because of current policy climate of check box type stuff, along with other policies, it can be difficult for returning citizens to get a job, to find gainful employment. So oftentimes entrepreneurship is the only viable way, right? The only people that are going to get them a job are themselves. And this organization prepares returning citizens while they're still incarcerated to be entrepreneurs. And I think that is a great example of sort of seeing an opportunity, understanding that the sort of situation at stand, and empowering people to take economic agency. Now, many of these people don't go on to have a high growth company, but they certainly go on to start companies, and oftentimes employer companies. So they will employ a couple other people as well. If you, I can Delaney or IEDC folks, I can provide sort of context and information for all the people on the webinar.
Wonderful, thank you. So Jeff, I'm going to put this next one to you because you had talked about sustainability in the incubator. So Phyllis Kraft-Hendrick asked a question: what strategies or methodologies are useful to assist improving sustainability? So I think we talked a little bit about that in measurements, but What do you think about that? What strategies or methodologies are useful to assist improving sustainability?
I think probably the most important thing is to demonstrate that you are continuing to attract, and I'm speaking now about incubators primarily, you're continually able to grow your numbers of clients or graduate clients and prove that you are starting to reach a level of revenues where you can eventually become self-sufficient. That is not always true in incubation programs, and sometimes that means that the incubation program needs to find a way to get a continual subsidy, if you will, from their public sector sponsors. And that subsidy is probably the wrong word. There are incubation programs that regularly receive money for the economic development that they accomplish by managing the incubator. For example, again, if they're creating jobs, they're graduating companies, the companies are being retained in the community and adding to the economy. That is worth something to an economic development corporation or to any organization that's trying to support economic growth. So it is not just a handout when an incubator, for example, there's one in New Mexico that has done quite well. They've built buildings, they've used EDA grants to construct additions to the incubator. They have a contract, it's small, but a contract that is renewed annually with their local economic development organization to pay them for the service they provide. And also renting out the space for, if you have excess space and you're making an effort to rent it, and you can attract people to come in there and use the space only, when it's not required for the entrepreneurs. That's another way of demonstrating that, one, you're entrepreneurial enough to understand that you have to become self-supporting, and two, that while you may not be, you can become sustainable if you have the, a certain amount of funding that is provided, let's say, on an annual basis. For example, in New Jersey, we had a commission on science and technology for about 10 years. And the commission on a regular basis had a grant program for the incubation programs in the state. Now they had to qualify by demonstrating that they were essentially that they were meeting their KPIs, that their key performance indicators were in fact positive, and they were creating or accomplishing what it was that the commission expected the organizations to do. You have to look at all of those kinds of things. Some incubators, in order to be sustainable, take equity from their client companies. It's not a great amount or a very large percentage that do, but some do, and use that the money if and when they are able to sell their equity, they can add to their or become more self-supporting in that way. So there's a lot of strategies, but it's more dependent, I believe, on the group running the incubator to be as entrepreneurial as they can in selling what it is that they do and making people realize that they are creating a public good through the employment and the dollars that they put through the economy doing their job.
Wonderful, thank you. So Delaney is telling me that it is time for us to wrap up. We did have one other question come in from Amy, and I'm probably going to mispronounce your name, Mizcles, on bridging a roots entrepreneurship ecosystem building effort with the city's economic development efforts. And what I'm going to do, Amy, if it's okay with you, is get your information from Delaney and make an online introduction between you and Evan, since he has worked with the mayor's office, and I think he would probably have some great feedback for you on that question. So again, just a reminder that you'll be receiving an evaluation for today's webinar. Please complete that, and you will be receiving the presentations for both of our presenters at the end of that. So thank you so much for being with us today, for sharing your thoughts and your questions. Again, I apologize that those didn't come in until close to the end, but we did get through all of them but one. And enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again for participating. And thank you so much to Jeff and to Evan for sharing their wisdom. We appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you, everyone.